Sometimes the loneliest people carry the biggest hearts, and sometimes it takes a child to remind us that everyone deserves to be seen. Marshall spent years invisible to his world, a janitor whose name nobody bothered to learn. He sits alone in the alley behind old brick apartments, his faded uniform telling the story of a man forgotten by everyone around him. The residents walk past him like he's part of the building itself. But one morning, a foster child named Nia sees something different. She calls him Magic Man and believes he's a superhero hiding in plain sight. Her faith in him begins to change everything. What happens when a child's love transforms not just one man, but an entire community? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning alarm buzzed at 5:30, same as it had for the past 8 years. Marshall Hayes rolled out of his narrow bed, his knees protesting the movement with familiar aches. At 57, his body carried the weight of decades spent bending, lifting, and scrubbing. The small efficiency apartment held nothing but necessities. A bed, a table for one, a television that barely worked, and a kitchenette with a coffee maker that had seen better days. He pulled on his uniform, the same faded blue coveralls he'd worn since taking the janitor position at Riverside Apartments. The name tag stitched above the breast pocket read Marshall in block letters, though he couldn't remember the last time anyone had actually used his name. To most residents, he was simply part of the building's furniture, something that appeared when trash needed collecting or when a light bulb needed changing, then disappeared just as quickly. The walk to work took 15 minutes through streets lined with brick buildings that had weathered decades of city life. Riverside Apartments stood 4 stories tall, housing 32 units filled with people who barely acknowledged each other's existence, much less his. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, had hired him after his previous job ended, asking few questions about his sparse resume. She paid him fairly and left him alone, which suited Marshall just fine. His daily routine never varied. First, he collected trash from each floor, wheeling the heavy bins through hallways that smelled of coffee and morning hurry. Residents hurried past him, eyes focused on phones or watches, occasionally stepping around him as if he were an obstacle. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2B sometimes nodded, a gesture Marshall had come to appreciate as genuine kindness, even if no words accompanied it. The second-floor hallway held the building's most challenging residents. The Hendersons in 2A complained about everything, leaving passive-aggressive notes about noise levels and maintenance requests. Their neighbor, Mr. Patterson, hadn't spoken to Marshall in 3 years, not since Marshall had accidentally bumped into his expensive briefcase while mopping. Patterson now made a show of waiting for Marshall to finish before walking down the hall. Third floor brought different challenges. Young families with children who left toys in hallways and fingerprints on walls Marshall had just cleaned. Sarah Mitchell in 3C seemed overwhelmed, always juggling her 5-year-old son Tommy while balancing work calls. She offered apologetic smiles when Tommy scattered cereal in the elevator, but never lingered long enough for conversation. The 4th floor housed the building's elderly residents. Mr. Peterson in 4A moved slowly with his walker, sometimes pausing to rest while Marshall worked. They developed a silent understanding. Marshall would slow his pace when cleaning near Peterson's apartment, and Peterson would wait patiently without complaint. Mrs. Kumar in 4D often left her door slightly open, and Marshall caught glimpses of her watching television, alone most days. By 9 a.m., Marshall completed his indoor rounds and moved to the building's exterior. The alley behind Riverside Apartments had become his refuge, a narrow space between buildings where delivery trucks rarely ventured. A weathered wooden bench sat against the brick wall, his bench, though he'd never claimed it officially. Here, he ate lunch from a brown bag, watched pigeons peck at crumbs, and enjoyed the only peace his day offered. The bench held the wear patterns of his daily presence. The wood had been smoothed by years of his weight, and he'd even carved a small notch in the armrest during a particularly difficult winter. This spot offered him invisibility and respite, qualities he'd grown to value above all else. That Tuesday morning in late September started like any other. Marshall finished his rounds, grabbed his lunch bag, and headed to his bench. The autumn air carried hints of changing seasons, and he pulled his jacket closer as he settled into his familiar spot. He unwrapped the same sandwich he packed every day, peanut butter and jelly on white bread, and opened a thermos of coffee that had gone, lukewarm during his morning work. The first sign something was different came as small footsteps echoing in the alley. Marshall looked up to see a girl, maybe 7 years old, with dark hair pulled into messy pigtails and wearing a t-shirt with a faded cartoon character. She stood at the alley's entrance, hands on her hips, studying him with the unabashed curiosity only children possessed. "Are you the magic man?" she asked, walking closer without invitation. Marshall nearly choked on his coffee. In 8 years of eating lunch on this bench, no one had ever approached him, much less started a conversation. "I'm sorry, what?" he managed. The girl stepped closer, tilting her head as if examining him for clues. "Mrs. Foster said there's a magic man who keeps our building clean and fixes broken things. She said he works early in the morning before most people wake up like magic." Mrs. Foster must be the woman in 3B, Marshall realized. He'd seen her occasionally, a middle-aged woman who always seemed tired. He hadn't known she'd noticed his work schedule, much less described him to anyone. "I'm just the janitor," Marshall said quietly. "That's what Magic Man would say," the girl replied with absolute certainty. "I'm Nia. I'm staying with Mrs. Foster for a while. She's my foster mom, but I probably won't be staying long." "I never do." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this information struck Marshall unexpectedly. This child, who couldn't be more than 7, spoke of temporary homes with the resignation of someone much older. "What makes you think I'm magic?" he asked, surprised by his own willingness to continue the conversation. Nisha pointed to his toolbox, which sat beside the bench. "You carry a magic toolbox that fixes everything. Mrs. Foster's sink stopped dripping after you visited. Mr. Peterson's door doesn't squeak anymore. The elevator buttons light up better now. That's magic." Marshall looked at his dented metal toolbox, the same one he'd carried for years. To him, it contained nothing more than basic maintenance tools, screwdrivers, pliers, and supplies for minor repairs. But through this child's eyes, it had transformed into something special. "Sometimes people just need small things fixed," he said. "That's exactly what Magic Man would do," Nia declared, settling cross-legged on the ground in front of his bench. "Can I eat lunch with you? Mrs. Foster packed me a sandwich, but eating alone is boring." Marshall glanced around the alley, wondering if this was appropriate. Foster children probably had rules about talking to strangers. But the girl had already unpacked her lunch, a sandwich and an apple, and was looking at him expectantly. "I suppose that would be all right," he said. For the first time in years, Marshall Hayes wasn't eating lunch alone. 3 weeks passed before Marshall realized how much he'd begun to look forward to lunch. Nia appeared in the alley each day like clockwork, always carrying her small brown bag and an endless stream of questions. She wanted to know about his tools, his work schedule, and his theories on everything from why pigeons walked instead of hopped to whether buildings had feelings. Their conversations had evolved into something Marshall hadn't experienced in years, genuine connection. Nia listened when he explained how to fix a leaky faucet, her eyes wide with concentration. She shared stories about the different foster homes she'd lived in, each tale delivered with a child's honesty that both broke and warmed his heart. "Mrs. Foster is nice," Nia had told him the previous Friday, "but she's always worried about something. She talks on the phone a lot about me, using words like placement and stability. I don't think she thinks I'm staying." Marshall had learned to read the subtle signs in Nia's expressions. When she talked about foster homes, her shoulders tensed slightly, and she spoke faster, as if rushing through painful subjects. But when she talked about their daily meetings or her drawings of his magical work around the building, her whole face brightened. That Thursday started differently. Marshall arrived at his bench to find it empty, which wasn't unusual. Nia sometimes stayed upstairs to help Mrs. Foster with household chores. But when 1 o'clock passed, then 1:30 without her appearance, he began to feel an unfamiliar concern. He was packing up his lunch when he heard it, soft crying coming from behind the dumpster at the far end of the alley. Marshall stood slowly, listening. The sound was definitely a child, and he was certain it was Naya. He found her crouched behind the large green dumpster, knees pulled to her chest, her small body shaking with sobs. In her hand she clutched a wrinkled piece of paper. "Nia." Marshall knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "What's wrong?" She looked up at him with red, puffy eyes, then thrust the paper toward him. "They're moving me again," she whispered. "Mrs. Foster got a letter. I have to go to a new family next week." Marshall took the paper with careful hands. It was official letterhead from the Department of Children and Family Services, written in the dry, bureaucratic language that reduced this child's life to case numbers and placement decisions. The letter informed Mrs. Foster that Nia would be transferred to the Johnsons, a family across town. The following Tuesday, "Mrs. Foster says it's nothing she did wrong," Nia continued, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "She says the Johnsons are nice people who want to adopt, and that's better for me than staying with someone who's just temporary. But I don't want better. I want to stay here. I want to have lunch with you every day." The words hit Marshall with unexpected force. In 3 weeks, this child had become the brightest part of his days, though he'd barely acknowledged it to himself. The thought of her disappearing, of returning to his solitary lunches, felt like losing something precious he'd just discovered. "Maybe the new family will be wonderful," he said, though the words felt hollow. "Maybe they'll live near a nice school, or have a big yard where you can play." Nia shook her head fiercely. "I don't want a big yard. I want to stay here and watch you do magic things. I want to keep drawing pictures of you fixing stuff. I want to keep being your lunch friend." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to him. It was one of her drawings, created with crayon and colored pencils. The image showed Marshall standing in front of the Riverside Apartments building, wearing a cape that looked suspiciously like his work uniform. Around him she'd drawn residents smiling and waving. At the bottom, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "Marshall the Magic Man makes everyone happy." Marshall stared at the drawing, seeing himself through her eyes for the first time. In her version, he wasn't invisible or ignored. He was central to the building's life, someone who mattered to the community around him. "This is beautiful," he said quietly. "It's how I see you," Nia replied. "Mrs. Foster says nobody else talks about you much, but I watch from the window sometimes. Mr. Peterson walks better since you fixed his door. Mrs. Rodriguez doesn't have to put that bucket under her sink anymore. The elevator doesn't make scary noises. You do magic things every day, but nobody says thank you." Marshall realized this child had been paying attention to details that escaped even him. He'd simply been doing his job, performing routine maintenance, but she'd seen the human impact of his work. "Can't you tell them I should stay?" Nia asked. "If you explain that you need me for lunch, maybe they'd listen." The hope in her voice made Marshall's chest tight. How could he explain that he held no influence over the decisions that shaped her life? That he was just a building janitor who most residents barely noticed? "I don't think it works that way," he said gently. Nia's face crumpled again. "It's because nobody important cares about me. Mrs. Foster is nice, but she's not my real family. The caseworker lady just sees me as paperwork. If I had someone who really mattered, like a dad or a grandfather or someone, they could say I should stay." The innocent logic of her words pierced something deep in Marshall's chest. This child, who saw magic in his mundane work, who had brought light into his solitary existence, was about to be moved again through the indifferent machinery of a system that saw her as a case to be managed rather than a person with feelings and preferences. "You matter to me," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Nia looked up at him with sudden intensity. "Really? Really? Our lunches have become the best part of my day. I'd look forward to hearing about your morning, seeing your drawings, listening to your ideas about everything." "Then can't you do something?" she asked. Can't Magic Man figure out a way? Marshall looked at this child who believed in him, who saw capabilities he'd never recognized in himself. For years, he'd accepted invisibility, convinced himself that his small role in maintaining the building was enough. But Nia's faith in him suggested possibilities he'd never considered. "I don't know what I could do," he admitted. "Magic Man would find a way," she said with absolute certainty. "I believe in you." That evening, Marshall sat in his small apartment, staring at Nia's drawing taped to his refrigerator. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something he'd thought was buried forever, the desire to fight for something that mattered. The foster care letter lay on his kitchen table beside his dinner plate, a reminder that he had less than 5 days to figure out if an invisible janitor could somehow become the magic man that Nia believed him to be. Friday morning arrived with Marshall feeling different, restless in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He'd spent the night thinking about Nia's words, about her belief that Magic Man would find a way. While he still didn't know what he could possibly do about her placement, he found himself wondering what would happen if he stopped being invisible. His morning routine felt the same, but his awareness had shifted. As he collected trash from the second floor, he noticed Mrs. Rodriguez struggling with her apartment door, juggling grocery bags while fumbling with keys that didn't seem to want to cooperate. Instead of continuing past as he normally would, Marshall stopped. "The lock's been sticking lately, hasn't it?" he asked. Mrs. Rodriguez looked surprised that he'd spoken. "Oh, yes, for weeks now. I keep meaning to call the office, but it's not broken exactly, just difficult. Would you like me to take a look? I have some lubricant that might help." 20 minutes later, Marshall had the lock working smoothly. Mrs. Rodriguez insisted on making him coffee, the first time a resident had ever invited him into their apartment. "I had no idea you were so skilled," she said, watching him pack his tools. "I always see you working, but I never realized you could fix things like this." "Just basic maintenance," Marshall replied, but her gratitude felt good in a way he'd forgotten. When he reached the 3rd floor, he encountered a different problem. Sarah Mitchell stood outside her apartment with 5-year-old Tommy, both of them looking frustrated. "The doorknob keeps falling off," Sarah explained when she noticed Marshall watching. "I've tried to tighten it, but I think I'm making it worse. My landlord said he'd send someone, but that was 2 weeks ago." Marshall examined the loose doorknob, seeing immediately that the screws had stripped their threads. "I can fix this properly," he said. "It'll take about 15 minutes. While he worked, Tommy watched with fascination reminiscent of Nia's attention. "Are you the magic man?" Tommy asked suddenly. Marshall nearly dropped his screwdriver. "What did you say?" "Nia in 3B told me about Magic Man. She said he fixes things that are broken and makes the building better. Are you him?" Sarah looked puzzled. "I don't know any Nia in 3B. Mrs. Foster lives there." "Nia's staying with Mrs. Foster," Marshall explained. "She's Mrs. Foster's foster daughter." "I had no idea Mrs. Foster had a child staying with her," Sarah said. "I should introduce myself. Tommy could use a friend in the building." The doorknob repair went perfectly, and Sarah's relief was evident. "Thank you so much. I was starting to worry about safety with a loose door." "Can I pay you something for the repair?" "It's part of my job," Marshall said, though he realized it really wasn't. Building maintenance handled major repairs, not individual tenant issues like this. "Well, if there's ever anything I can do for you, please ask," Sarah said warmly. As Marshall continued his rounds, he found himself looking at the building differently. The 4th-floor hallway's flickering light fixture wasn't just an annoyance. It was something he could fix. Mr. Peterson's difficulty with his sticky front. It wasn't just an observation, it was a problem he could solve. By noon, Marshall had addressed 3 minor repairs that had been bothering residents for months. Each interaction felt different from his usual invisible maintenance work. People actually looked at him, spoke to him, thanked him by name. That afternoon, Marshall arrived at his bench with his toolbox and a new sense of purpose. When Nia appeared, her eyes were still red from yesterday's crying, but she managed a small smile. "Mrs. Foster says I have 5 more days," she said quietly. "She's trying to make them special days, but everything feels sad now." Marshall pulled a small notebook from his toolbox, something he'd purchased that morning on his way to work. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about Magic Man finding a way." Nia's eyes widened. "You have an idea?" "Maybe. But first I need to understand something. What exactly would you want to happen? If magic were real, what would be your perfect outcome?" Nia considered this seriously. "I'd want to stay here with Mrs. Foster. She's nice, and she doesn't get angry when I ask too many questions. And I'd want to keep having lunch with you every day. And maybe the other kids in the building would be my friends too." "What about Mrs. Foster? Does she want you to stay?" "I think so. Sometimes I hear her crying on the phone with the caseworker lady. She keeps saying it's not fair that I'm just getting settled, but she says the Johnsons have been waiting longer for a child, and they want to adopt right away." Marshall made notes as they talked. "Tell me about your caseworker." "Ms. Patterson. She's not mean, but she talks about me like I'm not there. She uses big words and acts like moving is no big deal, like I should be excited about new families." "Have you ever told her you want to stay here?" "She says kids don't always know what's best for them. She says the Johnsons have a big house and can give me more opportunities." Marshall wrote this down too. "What if someone else spoke up for you? Someone who could explain why staying here would be good." "Like who?" "Mrs. Foster already tried." "Like the community? The other people in the building who've gotten to know you and seen how well you're doing here?" Nia looked confused. "But nobody else knows me. I only talk to you and Mrs. Foster. That might be something we could change," Marshall said carefully. "What if people got to know you? What if they could see what I see, that you're a smart, caring girl who's finding her place here? How would that work?" Marshall wasn't entirely sure himself, but an idea was forming. What if Magic Man started doing more magic around the building? What if people started noticing the good things happening here, and they realized you were part of that? Nia's expression brightened slightly. "Would you really do that?" "I'm going to try, but I'll need your help." "What kind of help?" Marshall looked at his notebook, then at this child who had somehow awakened something in him he'd thought was gone forever. "I need you to help me stop being invisible. I need you to help me figure out how to be the person you think I am." Nia jumped up from where she'd been sitting. "Yes, I knew Magic Man would find a way." That evening, Marshall sat in his apartment planning. He'd filled several pages in his notebook with observations about the building's residents, their problems, and small ways he might help. It wasn't magic. It was just paying attention and using the skills he'd always had. But if Nia wanted to see magic, maybe it was time he started believing in it too. Saturday brought Marshall's first real test of stepping out of invisibility. Armed with his notebook and a determination he hadn't felt in years, he knocked on Mrs. Foster's apartment door that morning before starting his regular work. The woman who answered looked tired, but kind, with graying hair and worry lines around her eyes. "You must be Marshall," she said immediately. "Nia talks about you constantly." "I'm Linda Foster. I hope I'm not intruding," Marshall said. "I wanted to speak with you about Nia's situation." Linda's expression grew cautious. "If this is about her placement, I appreciate your concern, but the decision's been made. The agency thinks the Johnsons can offer her more stability. May I ask what you think?" Linda looked surprised by the directness of his question. After a moment, she stepped aside to let him in. Her apartment was warm and lived in, with Nia's drawings covering the refrigerator and coloring books scattered on the coffee table. "Honestly, I think it's a mistake," Linda said, settling into a worn armchair. "Nia's been through 5 different homes in 2 years. Each time, just as she starts to settle in, they move her to someone they think is better. She needs consistency, not another fresh start. Have you told them this?" "Until I'm hoarse. But I'm 58 years old. I work part-time, and I rent this apartment. On paper, the Johnsons look better. They're younger, own their home, and the husband has a management position at a bank. The caseworker sees numbers, not relationships." Marshall pulled out his notebook. "What if the numbers changed? What if you could show them that Nia is thriving here, that she's part of a community? Linda laughed, but not unkindly. What community? I barely know my neighbors. Most days, the only adult conversation I have is with the grocery store cashier. That could change too, Marshall said. Nia believes I'm some kind of magic man who can fix things. Maybe it's time I started living up to that. Over the next hour, Marshall explained his idea. Linda listened with growing interest as he outlined his observations about the building's residents and their various needs. Not just maintenance issues, but the isolation that seemed to affect everyone. You really think people would respond to that? Linda asked. Nia saw something in me that I'd forgotten existed, Marshall replied. Maybe other people just need someone to see them too. That afternoon, Marshall began his campaign in earnest. His first stop was Mr. Peterson on the 4th floor. The elderly man answered his door slowly, looking surprised to see Marshall standing there with his toolbox. Is something wrong with the building? Mr. Peterson asked. Actually, I noticed you've been having trouble with your door sticking, and the lighting in the hallway isn't great for someone using a walker. I thought I might make some improvements, if that's all right with you. An hour later, Mr. Peterson's door opened smoothly, and Marshall had installed a motion-activated light near the elevator. More importantly, they talked, really talked, for the first time in years. I didn't realize you'd been in the military, Mr. Peterson said, as Marshall packed his tools. Army myself, Korea. Navy, Marshall replied. 2 tours? Well, I'll be damned. All this time I had a fellow veteran right here in the building. The conversation that followed revealed depths Marshall never would have imagined. Mr. Peterson had served in Korea, lost friends, carried his own invisible wounds. They spoke the same language of service, sacrifice, and the difficulty of returning to civilian life. You know, Mr. Peterson said, as Marshall prepared to leave. I've got some experience with electronics from my Navy days. If you ever need help with repairs around here, I'd be happy to lend a hand. Sunday morning brought Marshall to the Hendersons' door on the 2nd floor. The couple who had complained about everything for years answered together, both looking suspicious. We didn't call for maintenance, Mr. Henderson said curtly. I know. I noticed your window in the laundry room doesn't close properly, and with winter coming, that's going to drive up your heating costs. I thought I'd fix it. Mrs. Henderson peered at him skeptically. What's this going to cost us? Nothing. It's just something I can do. The window repair led to fixing a loose cabinet door, which led to adjusting a wobbly table leg. By the time Marshall finished, the Hendersons were actually smiling. They offered him coffee and cookies, and Mrs. Henderson mentioned that she'd been a teacher for 30 years before retiring. We always thought building maintenance was supposed to handle these things. Mrs. Henderson said, building maintenance handles major repairs, Marshall explained. But sometimes people need smaller things fixed too. You know, Harold used to do handyman work before we moved here, Mrs. Henderson said, glancing at her husband. Maybe he could help you with these smaller repairs. He's been looking for ways to stay busy. Monday arrived with Marshall, feeling cautiously optimistic. His weekend efforts had created something new. Residents were actually noticing him, speaking to him, treating him like a person rather than a fixture. At lunch, Nia was practically bouncing with excitement. Mrs. Rodriguez told Mrs. Foster that you fixed her door and made her coffee. And Tommy's mom said you're the nicest man in the building. People are starting to see your magic. It's not magic, Nia. It's just helping people. Same thing, she declared with 7-year-old certainty. That afternoon, Marshall made a decision that surprised even him. He knocked on Mrs. Chen's office door. The building manager looked up from her paperwork with raised eyebrows. Marshall, is everything all right? I wanted to talk to you about the building community, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Mrs. Chen had always been fair but distant in their professional relationship. Now, as Marshall explained his observations about the residents' needs and his recent efforts to help them, she listened with growing interest. You've been doing all this on your own time? She asked. Yes, ma'am, and people have responded positively. More than I expected. They're also offering to help with other projects. Mrs. Chen leaned back in her chair, studying him. You know, in all the buildings I manage, this one has always felt the most disconnected. People keep to themselves. Complaints come through my office instead of neighbors talking to each other. But lately, I've noticed fewer complaint calls, more positive interactions. People just needed someone to pay attention to them, Marshall said. What exactly are you proposing? Marshall took a breath. There's a foster child staying with Linda Foster in 3B. Her name is Nia, and she's supposed to be moved to another home tomorrow. I think she's found her place here, and I think the community would benefit from keeping her. Mrs. Chen's expression grew serious. That's a family services matter, Marshall. I can't interfere with placement decisions. I'm not asking you to interfere. I'm asking if you'd be willing to write a letter about what you've observed, about the positive changes in the building, about Nia's integration into the community. Has she integrated into the community? Marshall pulled out his notebook, now filled with observations and plans.
She will have by the time her caseworker sees the letter.
I just need a little more time to make sure people know who she is and how much she belongs here. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, You have until 5 o'clock Tuesday, when her transfer is scheduled. If you can show me genuine community support for this child, I'll write that letter. Marshall felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with purpose. Tuesday morning arrived with less than 24 hours until Nia's scheduled transfer. Marshall woke before his alarm, his mind already racing through the plans he'd developed over the weekend. If he was going to prove that Nia belonged in this community, he needed to first create a community worth belonging to. His first stop was the building's roof access, a door he'd unlocked countless times for maintenance but never truly explored. The flat rooftop stretched across the entire building, surrounded by a low parapet wall and dotted with utility equipment. In one corner, someone had long ago attempted a garden, now just a collection of empty, weathered planters and a tangle of dead vines. Marshall stood among the abandoned planters, seeing possibilities where others might see failure. The space received plenty of sunlight, had access to water through the roof maintenance spigot, and offered a view of the city that was actually quite pleasant. More importantly, it could become something residents might want to share. He spent his morning shift making mental notes of every small repair and improvement the building needed. The lobby's overhead light flickered intermittently. The elevator had a loose panel that rattled. The second-floor hallway had a worn spot in the carpet that created a tripping hazard. Individually, these were minor issues that building management might address eventually. Together, they represented opportunities. At lunch, Marshall found Nia sitting on their bench, unusually quiet. Her foster care paperwork lay beside her, along with a small suitcase that hadn't been there yesterday. Ms. Patterson is coming at 5 o'clock, Nia said without preamble. Mrs. Foster packed my things this morning. She kept crying and saying she was sorry. Marshall sat beside her, feeling the weight of the promises he'd made. I'm not giving up yet. Mrs. Foster says sometimes adults have to accept things they can't change. She says that's what being grown up means. Maybe, but sometimes being grown up means fighting for what matters. Even when it seems impossible, Nia looked at him with eyes that seemed too old for her 7 years. Do you really think you can change their minds? I think Magic Man can do a lot of things if people believe in him, Marshall said. But I need your help with something important. He pulled out his notebook, now filled with diagrams and lists. I found something on the roof that could be special. Want to see? 20 minutes later, Nia stood among the abandoned planters, her imagination already transforming the space. It could be a garden, like the one at my first foster home, but better because it's up high where you can see everything. Exactly. But not just any garden. A community garden where everyone in the building helps grow things. Where people come together to work on something beautiful and have meetings and maybe parties when the vegetables are ready. Marshall smiled at her enthusiasm. But here's the thing. If this is going to work, people need to see that you're part of making it happen. They need to understand that you belong here because you contribute something special. For the rest of the afternoon, Marshall and Nia worked together on the roof. Using supplies from his maintenance storage, they cleared debris, arranged the planters into organized rows, and began the work of transformation. Nia proved surprisingly helpful, her small hands perfect for detailed work, her creativity endless when it came to planning which vegetables might grow where. At 4 o'clock, Marshall made his move. He began knocking on doors, starting with the residents he'd helped over the past few days. Mrs. Rodriguez answered immediately. "Marshall, is everything all right? I wonder if you could spare 10 minutes to see something I think you'd find interesting." "It's on the roof." Mrs. Rodriguez followed him upstairs, and her reaction was everything Marshall had hoped for. "Oh my goodness, this could be beautiful. I had a garden when I lived in my house, before I downsized. I miss growing my own tomatoes." Mr. Peterson was next, followed by Sarah and Tommy, then even the Hendersons. One by one, Marshall led small groups to the roof, where Nia waited to explain their vision. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Marshall watched as adults who had lived as strangers for years began talking to each other about seeds and seasons and shared responsibilities. This little girl thought of all this. Mrs. Henderson asked, watching Nia demonstrate how the watering system might work. "She's got quite an imagination," Marshall replied. "She sees possibilities where the rest of us might see problems." By 4:30, Marshall had gathered nearly half the building's residents on the roof. The abandoned space had filled with voices and laughter as people shared gardening experiences and debated the merits of different vegetables. Mrs. Chen arrived just as the impromptu gathering was hitting its stride. Marshall had called her 20 minutes earlier, simply saying that she might want to see what was happening on the roof. The building manager stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. Residents who barely acknowledged each other in the hallways were now clustered around makeshift planting areas, listening intently as 7-year-old Nia explained her ideas for companion planting. "How long has this been going on?" Mrs. Chen asked quietly. "About an hour," Marshall replied. "But the planning started yesterday. Nia's been the driving force behind the whole thing, the child who's being transferred today." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Chen watched as Mr. Peterson, who had barely spoken to anyone in the building for years, knelt beside Nia to examine one of the planters. Sarah's son, Tommy, was drawing garden plans with crayons on the back of an envelope, while his mother discussed herb varieties with Mrs. Rodriguez. "I've managed this building for 6 years, Mrs. Chen said. "I've never seen residents interact like this. Nia has a gift for bringing people together," Marshall said. "She sees connections where adults might see barriers." At 4:45, Marshall heard footsteps on the roof access stairs. A woman in a business suit appeared in the doorway, looking official and slightly out of place among the gardening enthusiasts. "Ms. Patterson," Linda Foster said, approaching with obvious nervousness. "You're early." The caseworker surveyed the scene with professional detachment. "Mrs. Foster, what exactly is going on here?" Before Linda could answer, Nia spotted the newcomer and bounded over with her characteristic enthusiasm. "Are you Miss Patterson? I'm so glad you're here. You have to see our community garden. Mr. Peterson is going to teach me about composting, and Mrs. Rodriguez knows how to grow the best tomatoes, and Marshall, he's the magic man, figured out how to make this whole space work for everyone." Ms. Patterson looked overwhelmed by Nia's rapid-fire explanation. "Nia, we need to discuss your transfer to the Johnson family. Could you gather your belongings, please? But you haven't seen the garden plan yet. And Mr. Henderson said he'd bring his tools to help build the raised beds. And Mrs. Chen said she'd talk to the building owners about getting proper soil delivered." Marshall watched as Miss Patterson's professional composure wavered slightly in the face of Nia's genuine excitement. Around them, the other residents had grown quiet, sensing the tension. "Miss Patterson," Mrs. Chen stepped forward. "I'm the building manager. I wonder if I could speak with you privately for a moment." The two women moved to a corner of the roof while the residents continued their planning, though Marshall noticed everyone was listening carefully to the conversation happening 20 feet away. After several minutes, Mrs. Chen returned with Ms. Patterson, who now looked less certain than she had upon arrival. "I understand there's been some community involvement around Nia's placement here," Ms. Patterson said. Addressing the group, Mr. Peterson stood up from where he'd been examining soil samples. "Young lady, I've lived in this building for 8 years, and until this week I couldn't tell you the names of 5 other residents. This child changed that. She's got people talking to each other, working together. That's not something you see every day. And she's so good with children," Sarah added, watching Tommy show Nia his garden drawings. "Tommy's been asking when his new friend can come play again. I had no idea there was another child in the building." Mrs. Henderson nodded in agreement. "We've lived here for 5 years and never participated in any building activities because there weren't any. Now we're planning to spend our weekends working on a community project. That's this little girl's doing." Ms. Patterson looked around at the faces, adults who were clearly invested in Nia's presence in their building. "This is all very touching, but the Johnson family has been waiting for placement for over a year. They've prepared for Nia's arrival, decorated a room, enrolled her in a good school district. What about what Nia has prepared for here?" Marshall asked, surprising himself with his boldness. "What about the connections she's made, the community she's building?" "Mr. Hayes, is it?" Ms. Patterson consulted her paperwork. "You're the building's maintenance worker?" "I'm someone who's gotten to know Nia over the past month, someone who's seen how she brings out the best in people." Ms. Patterson looked at her watch. "It's 5 o'clock. The Johnsons are expecting us." The roof fell silent, except for the distant sounds of city traffic below. Marshall felt the moment slipping away, all their efforts reduced to a schedule conflict and bureaucratic protocol. Then Nia stepped forward, her small voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. "Miss Patterson, could I ask you something?" Miss Patterson looked down at Nia with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to managing children during difficult transitions. "What is it, Nia?" "How many times have I been moved to new families?" The caseworker consulted her file. "This would be your 6th placement in 2 years. And how many times did I ask to stay where I was?" Miss Patterson's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. "Nia, children don't always understand what's best for their long-term development." "5 times," Nia interrupted quietly. "I asked to stay 5 times, and you said the new family would be better. But every time I start to feel like I belong somewhere, you move me again." The adults on the roof exchanged glances. Marshall felt his heart breaking for this child who had learned to articulate her own displacement with such painful clarity. "The Johnsons are a wonderful family," Miss Patterson began. "So were the Millers, and the Garcias, and the first family, the Thompsons, who said they wanted to adopt me until they decided they wanted a baby instead." Nia's voice remained steady, but Marshall could see her hands trembling slightly. "Do you know what's different about this place?" Miss Patterson waited. "Nobody here promised me forever. Mrs. Foster said from the beginning that she was just temporary. But she also said I could stay as long as I needed to. And Marshall never said he'd be my family. But he shows up every day for lunch and listens to me like what I say matters." Marshall felt something tight in his chest as Nia continued. "And Mr. Peterson taught me about his plants. And Mrs. Rodriguez showed me how to make her special cookies. And Mrs. Chen let me help her organize the maintenance closet. They didn't promise me they'd be my new family. They just let me be part of what they were already doing." The roof had grown very quiet. Even the city noise seemed muted as Nia spoke with the wisdom of someone far older than her 7 years. "Maybe I don't need someone to adopt me right away. Maybe I just need to belong somewhere while I grow up. And maybe the Johnsons are nice people, but they're strangers who want me to fit into their life. These people already let me fit into theirs." Miss Patterson looked around at the faces of the residents, all of whom were watching this conversation with rapt attention. Marshall could see her struggling between policy and the human reality playing out in front of her. "Nia, the agency has determined that the Johnsons can provide more stability. What if we could provide stability too?" Linda Foster spoke up, her voice stronger than Marshall had heard it before. "What if this community could offer Nia the consistency she needs?" "Mrs. Foster, you're a single woman with limited income, who lives in a building full of people who care about this child," Mr. Peterson interrupted. "I may be old, but I'm not dead. I can help keep an eye on her after school. Sarah here works from home most days. Mrs. Rodriguez loves children and has been missing having little ones around since her grandchildren moved to Florida. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Tommy needs a friend, and I'd be happy to help with childcare when Linda's working. And I've been thinking about after-school programs, Mrs. Henderson added, surprising everyone. My daughter's grown now, but I remember how hard it was to juggle work and childcare. Maybe we could organize something here in the building. Marshall watched as Ms. Patterson processed this unexpected show of community support. Her professional training was clearly at odds with what she was witnessing. These are all generous offers, Ms. Patterson said carefully, but the agency looks for proven stability. Established families with experience, like the 5 families that didn't work out. Marshall asked, his voice gentle but pointed. Ms. Patterson looked at him sharply. Those placements didn't fail because of the families. Sometimes children have difficulty adjusting, or sometimes children know when they've found the right place. Mrs. Chen interjected. Ms. Patterson, I've managed residential properties for 15 years. I've seen a lot of communities, and most of them exist only on paper. But what's happened in this building over the past week is real. These residents have connected with each other because of this child. She's not just living here, she's contributing to something larger. A garden project doesn't constitute a stable family environment. No, Marshall said, but caring adults who show up consistently do. And that's what Nia has found here. Ms. Patterson looked at her watch again, then at Nia, who had been listening to the adults advocate for her with growing amazement. Even if I were inclined to reconsider the placement, the Johnsons are expecting Nia this evening. They've made arrangements, taken time off work. What if we ask them to wait just 1 week? Linda Foster suggested. 1 week for you to evaluate what we're offering here. If you still think the Johnson placement is better after seeing how this community functions, we won't fight the decision. And what if the Johnsons won't wait? Then maybe they're not the right family either, Nia said quietly. If they really want me, wouldn't they want what's best for me? Wouldn't they want to make sure I'm ready? The wisdom in this child's words seemed to affect even Ms. Patterson, who was quiet for a long moment. Studying the group of adults who had rallied around Nia, I would need to see concrete evidence of community support, she said finally. Not just good intentions, but actual systems in place. Childcare arrangements, educational support, clear boundaries and responsibilities. We can do that, Mrs. Chen said immediately. Give us 1 week to show you how this community can work. Marshall felt hope stirring again, but tempered by the knowledge that they were asking for a miracle in bureaucratic terms, for a system designed around nuclear families to recognize the value of community support. I'll need to make some calls, Ms. Patterson said. The Johnsons will need to be contacted. My supervisor will need to approve the delay, but you'll consider it. Nia asked, her voice small but hopeful. Ms. Patterson looked down at this child, who had been moved 5 times in 2 years, who had learned to advocate for herself with heartbreaking eloquence, who had somehow created a community of adults willing to fight for her. I'll consider it, she said. 1 week. But I'll need to see real progress, not just promises. As Ms. Patterson left to make her phone calls, Marshall felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The weight and joy of shared responsibility, of being part of something larger than himself. The week that followed, Ms. Patterson's conditional approval passed in a blur of activity. The residents of Riverside Apartments threw themselves into proving their commitment to Nia with an enthusiasm that surprised even Marshall. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a childcare rotation. Mr. Peterson started an informal tutoring program for after-school homework help, and the Hendersons researched educational enrichment activities they could facilitate in the building's community room. Marshall found himself at the center of it all, coordinating schedules and managing the logistics of their makeshift support system. The community garden project had become a rallying point, with residents contributing both labor and supplies to transform the rooftop space into something genuinely beautiful. By Thursday afternoon, Marshall felt cautiously optimistic about their chances. Ms. Patterson was scheduled to return Friday morning for her evaluation, and everything seemed to be falling into place. That's when Nia appeared at his bench with an expression he'd never seen before, guilty and worried in equal measure. "Marshall, I need to tell you something," she said, settling beside him with unusual heaviness. "Something I probably should have told you before." "What is it?" Nia pulled a folded paper from her pocket, not one of her drawings, but what looked like an official document. "I found this in Mrs. Foster's papers yesterday when I was helping her organize. I wasn't supposed to see it, but..." Marshall took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was from the Department of Children and Family Services, but not the standard placement notification he'd expected. This document was older, more detailed, and as he read it, his understanding of Nia's situation shifted completely. "Nia," he said slowly, "this says you're not just any foster child. You're part of a specialized program for children with exceptional circumstances." "I know," she said quietly. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out." Marshall continued reading, his concern growing with each paragraph. According to the document, Nia had been removed from her original family, not because of abuse or neglect, but because her father was serving a 15-year federal prison sentence for embezzlement, and her mother had disappeared entirely, abandoning Nia at a relative's house before vanishing without a trace. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. The document also detailed psychological evaluations that painted a complex picture of Nia's behavior in previous foster homes. She had been described as manipulative and prone to fantasy by multiple caseworkers. There were reports of her creating elaborate stories about her foster families, insisting that temporary guardians were her real parents, and becoming disruptive when placement changes were discussed. "Nasir," Marshall said carefully, "these reports say you've had difficulties in other homes, that you sometimes have trouble distinguishing between what's real and what you wish were true." Nia's eyes filled with tears. "That's not fair. Just because I want families to love me doesn't mean I'm lying about anything. And just because I see good things in people doesn't mean I'm making stuff up." Marshall felt the ground shifting beneath his certainties. Had he been naive? Had this child, whom he'd seen as purely innocent, actually been manipulating the situation more skillfully than any of them realized? "The magic man thing," he said slowly. "Did you really see me that way, or was that something you said to make me feel special?" "Both," Nia admitted, her voice small. "I did see you doing magic things, fixing stuff, making people happier. But I also knew that if I made you feel important, you might want to help me stay here." The honesty of her admission hit Marshall harder than any deception could have. This 7-year-old had been operating with a level of strategic thinking that spoke to survival instincts no child should need to develop. "Are the other residents real friends to you? Or are they part of a plan too?" Nia wiped her nose with her sleeve. "They're real friends. But I also knew that if I got them to like me, it would be harder for Ms. Patterson to move me." "Is that bad? Does that make me a liar?" Marshall stared at this child who had been forced to become a tactician in her own life, who had learned to navigate adult systems with a sophistication that was both impressive and heartbreaking. "Nia, why are you telling me this now? Why risk everything when Ms. Patterson is coming tomorrow?" "Because I don't want to lie to you anymore," she said, tears streaming down her face. "All the other adults look at me and see either a problem to be solved or a sweet little girl who needs protection. But you see me like I'm a real person, and real people deserve to know the truth." Marshall set the document aside and really looked at Nia, not the idealized version he'd been protecting, but the complex, damaged, brilliant child who had been fighting for stability in the only ways she knew how. "So the community garden project was your idea, but I knew it would work because I've seen what happens when adults work together on something. I've been in enough homes to know what makes grown-ups feel good about themselves. And your belief in me as Magic Man is real. Just because I'm smart enough to know that believing in people makes them want to be better doesn't make the believing fake." Marshall was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. The child beside him was far more complicated than he'd realized, not a simple victim of circumstance, but someone who had learned to survive by understanding and influencing the adults around her. "Are you going to tell Miss Patterson what I told you?" Nia asked. Marshall looked at her. This 7-year-old, who'd been forced to become her own advocate, who had orchestrated a community response to her own displacement, not through deception, but through genuine insight into human nature. "What you've told me doesn't change anything important," he said finally. "You still need stability. You still deserve adults who care about you. You still brought this community together, even if you understood better than the rest of us why it would work. But I manipulated everyone." "No," Marshall said firmly. "You recognized what people needed and helped them find it. There's a difference between manipulation and insight. You saw Mr. Peterson was lonely and gave him someone to teach. You saw Mrs. Rodriguez missed having children around and gave her opportunities to nurture. You saw that I had forgotten how to matter to people and helped me remember. Is that really different?" Marshall smiled at her, the first genuine smile he'd felt since reading the document. "The fact that you're asking that question tells me everything I need to know about your character." But even as he comforted Nia, Marshall felt a new weight settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow's evaluation wouldn't just be about proving that their community could support a child. It would be about proving they could support this particular child. With all her complexity and strategic intelligence, he pulled out his notebook one more time, but now he was writing different plans. Plans that acknowledged Nia's exceptional abilities while still fighting for her right to belong somewhere. Plans that would help him explain to Miss Patterson that some children needed communities, not because they were simple and innocent, but precisely because they were complicated and brilliant. Friday morning was less than 12 hours away, and Marshall realized their fight wasn't just about keeping Nia in their building anymore. It was about proving that a community could embrace a child who was complex and strategic and brilliant, not in spite of those qualities, but because of them. He looked at the document again, then at Nia, who was watching him with the careful attention of someone who had learned that adults' reactions could change everything. "We're going to tell them the truth," he said. "All of it. Your intelligence, your survival skills, your ability to see what people need. We're going to show them that those aren't weaknesses to be fixed. They're strengths that make you exactly the kind of person this community wants to support." For the first time that afternoon, Nia's smile was completely genuine. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed designed to dampen spirits. Marshall had barely slept, his mind cycling through every detail of their week-long preparation and every revelation from Nia's confession. By 5 a.m., he was dressed and walking the building's halls, checking and double-checking the systems they'd put in place. The community garden on the roof looked remarkable despite the overcast sky. The residents had contributed far more than Marshall had expected. Proper soil, starter plants, a small greenhouse structure that Mr. Peterson had assembled with help from the Henderson's son, who worked in construction. More importantly, they'd created a schedule and responsibility chart that demonstrated genuine commitment to the project's maintenance. At 7 a.m., Marshall knocked on Linda Foster's door. She answered immediately, looking as sleepless as he felt. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Terrified," Linda admitted. "What if we've built up her hopes for nothing? What if Ms. Patterson decides this whole thing is just a nice experiment, but not substantial enough for long-term placement? Then we'll have given Nia something she's never had before, a community of adults who fought for her. That has to count for something." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Nia stood in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "Can we go over everything one more time?" For the next hour, the three of them reviewed their preparation. Linda had assembled documentation of Nia's improved behavior and academic performance during her month in the building. Marshall had prepared a maintenance log showing how the community garden project had led to other collaborative improvements throughout the building. Most importantly, they had letters from 7 different residents explaining their commitment to supporting Nia's continued placement. At 9 a.m., Mrs. Chen joined them, carrying a thick folder of her own documentation. "I spoke with my supervisor and the building's ownership group yesterday," she announced. "If Miss Patterson approves Nia's continued placement here, the owners are prepared to officially designate space for community activities and support an expanded resident engagement program." "What does that mean?" Nia asked. "It means they recognize the value of what you've helped create here, and they're willing to make it permanent policy rather than just allowing it informally." The weight of institutional support felt significant, but Marshall knew their real strength lay in something less official: the genuine relationships that had formed over the past week. At 10 a.m., residents began gathering in the building's community room, a space that had been largely unused until this week. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought homemade cookies. Mr. Peterson arrived with a folder of educational activities he'd researched for after-school programming. Sarah Mitchell brought her son Tommy, who had become Nia's constant companion and strongest supporter among the building's children. The Hendersons appeared with what looked like architectural drawings. "We took the liberty of designing a proper layout for the community room," Mrs. Henderson explained. "If this arrangement becomes permanent, the space should be optimized for multiple activities: homework supervision, community meetings, social gatherings." Marshall looked around at these people who had transformed from strangers into a functioning support network in barely a week. The cynical part of his mind wondered if their enthusiasm would sustain once the immediate crisis passed. But watching their interactions with Nia, he saw something deeper than temporary charity. The morning had brought one more surprise, a visitor Marshall hadn't expected. As he was reviewing final preparations, Mrs. Chen approached him with a puzzled expression. "Marshall, there's someone here to see you." "Says he's from the Veterans Administration?" A tall man in a suit stood in the lobby, holding a manila folder. "Mr. Hayes, I'm David Chen, no relation to your building manager. I'm a social worker with the VA. I understand you're involved in an unusual foster care situation." Marshall felt his chest tighten. "How did you hear about that?" "Ms. Patterson contacted our office yesterday. When she learned you were a veteran with documented PTSD, she wanted our assessment of your stability and fitness to be involved with a vulnerable child." The words hit Marshall like a physical blow. After everything they'd built, after all the community support they'd demonstrated, his past was still being used against them. "I see," Marshall said carefully. "Actually, you don't," David Chen said with a slight smile. "Ms. Patterson was looking for reasons to be concerned. But when I reviewed your file and spoke with your former commander, who still remembers you, by the way, I found something quite different." He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Your service record is exemplary. Your leadership during crisis situations was consistently praised. Most importantly, your recovery from trauma has been steady and well documented. You've been employed steadily, maintained housing, and shown no signs of instability." Marshall felt something loosen in his chest. "So you're here to provide a professional assessment that you represent no risk to this child, and that your military background actually makes you an unusually qualified community resource." David Chen looked around at the bustling preparation in the community room. "In fact, what you've organized here demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership skills that made you valuable in the Navy." At 10:30, Ms. Patterson arrived, accompanied by the same supervisor. From the previous week, Mrs. Kellerman carried a larger folder this time and wore an expression that suggested she was prepared for a thorough evaluation. "I understand you've had an active week," Ms. Patterson said, "surveying the organized chaos of residence, documentation, and preparation materials spread throughout the community room. We've tried to address every concern you raised," Linda Foster replied, her voice steady despite the obvious stress. "We have documented schedules, backup childcare arrangements, educational support systems, and formal commitments from multiple residents." Mrs. Kellerman nodded approvingly as she reviewed their materials. This is impressively organized, much more comprehensive than what we usually see in these situations. For the next hour, she and Ms. Patterson conducted interviews with individual residents, toured the community garden, and examined every aspect of the support system they'd created. Marshall watched Nia handle the questioning with remarkable composure, answering honestly about her needs and her feelings about the community they'd built. When Mrs. Kellerman interviewed Marshall privately, he made a decision that surprised even him. "There's something else you should know about Nia," he said. "Something that might change how you evaluate this situation." He told them about the document Nia had shown him, about her intelligence and strategic thinking, about her ability to understand and influence the adults around her. "You're telling us that this child has been manipulating the entire situation?" Mrs. Kellerman asked. "I'm telling you that she's brilliant," Marshall replied. "She recognized what this community needed and helped us find ways to provide it. She saw potential in people and helped them realize it. That's not manipulation, that's leadership. A 7-year-old cannot be expected to take responsibility for adult relationships." "No," Marshall agreed. "But a 7-year-old can be valued for the gifts she brings to those relationships. Nia doesn't need us to fix her or change her. She needs us to appreciate her exactly as she is." As the morning progressed, Marshall felt the weight of everything they'd built over the past week. The community that had formed around Nia was real, but it was also fragile. One negative assessment, one bureaucratic decision could scatter it all. But watching the residents interact with each other and with Nia, he realized something important. Regardless of what happened with the placement decision, they'd created something worth preserving. They discovered that they could be more than just people who happened to live in the same building. At noon, Ms. Patterson and Mrs. Kellerman stepped outside for their final consultation. The residents waited in the community room, their nervous energy palpable, despite attempts at normal conversation. Marshall found himself standing beside the window again, but this time he wasn't looking at his old solitary bench in the alley. He was looking at the future, whatever it might hold. When Ms. Patterson and Mrs. Kellerman returned to the community room, their expressions were unreadable. The assembled residents fell silent as the two women took their seats at the front of the room, their official folders and evaluation forms spread before them. Mrs. Kellerman spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "I want to begin by acknowledging what we've observed here today. In my 26 years of social work, I've rarely seen a community mobilize so quickly and thoroughly around a child's needs." Marshall felt a flicker of hope, but Mrs. Kellerman's tone suggested there was more to come. "However," she continued, "our primary responsibility is to ensure Nia's long-term stability and best interests. We must consider not just current enthusiasm, but sustainable support systems that will endure as circumstances change." She opened her folder and consulted her notes. "The community garden project is impressive, but seasonal activities don't constitute year-round stability. The childcare rotation shows good intentions, but none of the participating adults have formal training in child development or educational support." Mrs. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mr. Peterson's hand tightened on his folder of educational materials. "Furthermore," Mrs. Kellerman continued, "while Mrs. Foster has provided adequate care, her financial situation remains precarious. She works part-time, has no savings account, and lives in a rental apartment without long-term housing security." Linda Foster's face flushed, but she kept her composure. "Most significantly, our evaluation has revealed some concerning information about Mr. Hayes's background that wasn't included in the original case file." Marshall felt the room's attention shift to him. Confusion and concern evident on the faces of residents who had come to trust and rely on him. Ms. Patterson opened her own folder. "Mr. Hayes, you didn't disclose in our initial conversations that you're a military veteran with a medical discharge." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marshall realized that his carefully guarded past was about to become public in the worst possible Context, that's correct, he said quietly. You also didn't mention that you lost your wife and daughter in an automobile accident 9 years ago, and that you subsequently experienced what military records describe as severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. The residents were staring at him now, processing this information about someone they thought they knew. Marshall saw surprise in their faces, but not judgment, not yet. Can you explain why you withheld this information when you became involved in Nia's case? Marshall stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This was the moment he dreaded, when his carefully constructed invisibility would be stripped away entirely. Because I didn't think it was relevant to helping a child who needed community support, he said. My past tragedies don't change my ability to fix a leaky faucet or organize a maintenance schedule, but they might change your emotional stability and reliability as a support figure for a vulnerable child. Mrs. Kellerman interjected. Nia has already experienced multiple disruptions. Placing her in an environment where a key support person has undisclosed mental health issues could be seen as irresponsible. Marshall felt something building inside him, not anger. Exactly, but a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The room was completely silent as he processed how to respond. You're right, he said finally. I didn't tell you about my wife Rebecca and my daughter Emma. I didn't tell you that they died when a drunk driver ran a red light on a Tuesday afternoon 9 years ago. I didn't tell you that I spent 2 years afterward barely able to get out of bed, much less maintain employment or relationships. His voice grew stronger as he continued. I didn't tell you that I took this job because it was the only work I could handle. Simple, solitary, invisible. I didn't tell you that for 8 years. I convinced myself that not mattering to anyone was the same as being safe. He looked around the room at the faces of people who had become his community. But I also didn't tell you that I served 2 tours as a Navy logistics coordinator, responsible for supply operations that kept thousands of personnel fed, equipped, and safe. I didn't tell you that I received commendations for organization, leadership, and crisis management under pressure. Marshall reached into his pocket, and pulled out something. He'd been carrying for the past 3 days a small, velvet box containing military decorations he hadn't looked at in years. I didn't tell you about the Purple Heart I earned when our convoy was attacked, and I stayed at my post to coordinate evacuations, while medics treated my injuries. I didn't tell you about the Navy Achievement Medal for developing supply systems that improved efficiency across 3 bases. He set the box on the table in front of Mrs. Kellerman. Most importantly, I didn't tell you that everything I did for Nia and this community drew on skills and strength I learned in 20 years of military service. Skills that depression buried but didn't destroy. The room remained silent, but Marshall could feel the energy shifting. The residents were looking at him with new understanding, seeing not just the quiet janitor they'd known, but the leader he had once been and was becoming again. David Chen, the VA social worker, stepped forward. Mrs. Kellerman, if I may add something to Mr. Hayes's statement? Mrs. Kellerman nodded, clearly thrown off balance by the unexpected turn in the proceedings. I've reviewed Mr. Hayes's complete military and medical records. His recovery from trauma has been exemplary. More importantly, what he's accomplished here demonstrates exactly the leadership qualities that made him valuable in military service. He's taken a group of isolated individuals and created a functioning support network in less than 2 weeks. That's not the work of someone who's unstable. It's the work of someone who understands how to build effective teams under pressure. Mrs. Kellerman examined the military decorations with professional interest, but her expression remained skeptical. Mr. Hayes, while your service record is commendable, the fact remains that you've been essentially isolated for 8 years. Mental health recovery isn't linear, and the responsibility of supporting a traumatized child could trigger setbacks in your own healing process. Before Marshall could respond, Mr. Peterson stood up, his walker scraping against the floor. Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Kellerman looked startled by the interruption from the elderly veteran. I've been watching Marshall for years, Mr. Peterson continued, his voice gaining strength, not because I was nosy, but because I recognized something familiar. I've seen that look before, in mirrors, in VA waiting rooms, in the faces of men who've carried burdens they didn't know how to put down. He turned to address the room. This man lost his family and spent years punishing himself for surviving. But you know what I've watched him do this past month? I've watched him remember who he was before tragedy tried to erase him. Sarah Mitchell stood next. Mrs. Kellerman, I work in crisis counseling. I know the signs of someone struggling with mental health issues, and I also know the signs of someone who's found healthy ways to cope and contribute. Marshall has shown nothing but stability, reliability, and genuine care for everyone in this building. Mrs. Rodriguez joined them.
You want to talk about his qualifications?
This man organized 8 strangers into a functional support network in less than a week. He saw what each of us needed and helped us find ways to help each other. That's not the work of someone who's unstable. That's the work of someone who understands how communities heal. Mrs. Kellerman held up her hand. I appreciate everyone's support for Mr. Hayes, but the agency must consider risk factors objectively. Personal testimonials, while touching, don't override professional assessments of potential instability. Marshall felt the moment slipping away, their entire effort reduced to bureaucratic risk management. Then he heard a small voice from across the room. Can I say something? Everyone turned to look at Nia, who had been sitting quietly through the entire evaluation. Ms. Patterson consulted her notes. Nia, you've already provided your input during your individual interview. But I didn't tell you the most important thing, Nia interrupted, standing up with the kind of determination Marshall had come to recognize. I didn't tell you about Marshall's magic. Mrs. Kellerman's expression suggested she was losing patience with what she clearly viewed as a child's fantasy. Nia, we've discussed the difference between imagination and reality. This is reality, Nia said firmly. Marshall's magic is that he sees people who are invisible. Mr. Peterson was lonely, and Marshall saw that he needed someone to teach. Mrs. Rodriguez was sad because her grandchildren live far away, and Marshall saw that she needed someone to take care of. Sarah was tired from working and raising Tommy alone, and Marshall saw that she needed help. She walked to the center of the room, addressing the adults with a confidence that commanded attention. But the most important magic is that he sees me, not as a problem to solve or a sweet little girl to protect. He sees that I'm smart and that I understand things about people. He knows I figured out how to get everyone to like me, and he doesn't think that makes me bad. He thinks it makes me good at helping. Mrs. Kellerman leaned forward. Nia, are you saying you deliberately manipulated the residents of this building? I'm saying I helped them find what they needed, Nia replied without hesitation. Mr. Peterson needed to feel useful, so I asked him to teach me things. Mrs. Rodriguez needed someone to cook for, so I asked her to show me how to make cookies. The Hendersons needed a project to work on together, so I talked about how the building could be improved. Marshall watched as Mrs. Kellerman processed this admission, clearly uncertain how to categorize a child who spoke so openly about her strategic thinking. And Marshall, Nia continued, needed to remember that he was good at taking care of people, so I let him take care of me. But here's the thing. Even though I figured out what everyone needed, I also really needed all of them. That's what makes it real instead of fake. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, another one of her drawings. This one showed the entire building with every resident visible through the windows, all connected by lines of light that emanated from a figure in work clothes standing in the center. This is my family, she said, holding up the drawing. Not because anyone promised to adopt me, but because we all chose each other. And when people choose each other, that's more real than when they just get assigned to each other. The room was completely still as the 2 caseworkers absorbed what they'd heard. Marshall could see them struggling to reconcile their professional frameworks with the complex reality that Nia had articulated. Mrs. Kellerman looked at Ms. Patterson, then back at the assembled residents. This is highly unusual, she said slowly. The level of community organization, The child's sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, the integration of multiple support systems. It's what families look like when they're not limited by traditional structures, Linda Foster said quietly. It's what happens when people are allowed to care for each other in the ways that work best for everyone involved. Ms. Patterson closed her folder. We need to discuss this privately. Please give us a few minutes. As the two women stepped outside again, Marshall felt the weight of everything hanging in the balance. But looking around the room, at these people who had become his community, at Nia who had taught him to see magic in ordinary care, he realized that whatever decision came next, something precious had already been created. When Miss Patterson and Mrs. Kellerman returned 15 minutes later, their expressions had shifted from bureaucratic caution to something that looked almost like wonder. Mrs. Kellerman spoke first, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room hold their breath. In 26 years of social work, I've never encountered a situation quite like this one. A 7-year-old child who understands community dynamics better than most adults. A group of strangers who've transformed into a functional support network in 2 weeks. A military veteran who's channeled his leadership skills into creating something genuinely remarkable. She paused, consulting her notes one final time. The agency's mandate is to place children in environments that will provide stability, support, and opportunities for growth. Traditionally, we look for these qualities in nuclear family structures. But what we've observed here challenges us to recognize that families can take many forms. Marshall felt his heart racing as Mrs. Kellerman continued. We're prepared to approve Nia's continued placement with Mrs. Foster, with the understanding that she'll be supported by the community structure you've all created here. However, this approval comes with conditions. Linda Foster spoke first. What kind of conditions? Ms. Patterson opened a new folder. Monthly check-ins for the first 6 months, quarterly thereafter. Documentation of Nia's academic progress and social development. Formal agreements from the key support network members outlining their specific responsibilities. And, Mrs. Kellerman added, a commitment from building management to maintain the community programs you've established. This can't be dependent on individual goodwill. It needs institutional support. Mrs. Chen stepped forward. The ownership group has already approved converting the community room to permanent resident programming space. We're prepared to adjust Marshall's position to include community coordination responsibilities with appropriate compensation. Marshall looked around the room in amazement. Not only was Nia staying, but his role in the building was being officially recognized and expanded. The invisible janitor was becoming something he'd never imagined possible. Nia, who had been listening with characteristic intensity, raised her hand as if she were in school. Does this mean I can stay? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Mrs. Kellerman smiled, the first genuine smile Marshall had seen from her. It means you can stay, Nia. It means this community has convinced us that you've found your place. The room erupted in celebration. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately pulled Nia into a hug, while Mr. Peterson wiped tears from his eyes. Sarah's son Tommy cheered and asked if this meant Nia could come to his birthday party next month. Even the Hendersons were smiling, already discussing plans for expanding the community programming. But Marshall found himself stepping back, watching the scene with a mixture of joy and disbelief. 6 weeks ago, he had been eating lunch alone on a bench, invisible to the world around him. Now he was at the center of something extraordinary, a chosen family that had formed around a child's need and his own forgotten capacity for leadership. Miss Patterson approached him as the celebration continued around them. Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology. When I first learned about your involvement in this case, I was concerned about your stability and motivations. I was wrong. You were doing your job, Marshall replied. Protecting children is what matters most. Yes, but I was looking for traditional markers of stability and missing something more important. You've created something here that most families struggle to achieve: genuine interdependence, shared responsibility, and unconditional support. She handed him a business card. The agency has a program for developing alternative family structures for children with special needs. Would you be interested in consulting with us? There are other communities, other children who might benefit from what you've learned. Marshall took the card, considering the possibility. I'd need to think about that. This community has to come first, of course. But when you're ready, we'd welcome your expertise. As the caseworkers prepared to leave, Nia approached Marshall with her latest drawing. This one showed the building's residents gathered around the rooftop garden. But in the center stood a figure wearing both work clothes and a cape. Marshall as the magic man she'd always seen him to be. "This is for you," she said, "to remember that the magic was always real." 6 months later, Marshall stood on the roof garden at sunset, watching tomatoes ripen on healthy plants and listening to the sounds of community life drifting up from the apartments below. His new name tag read Marshall Hayes, Community Coordinator, but the residents still called him by his first name, and Nia still occasionally called him Magic Man when she thought no one was listening. The rooftop had become everything they'd envisioned and more. Residents gathered there for morning coffee, evening conversations, and weekend work parties. The Hendersons had organized a tool library. Mrs. Rodriguez taught cooking, classes using herbs from the garden. Mr. Peterson's tutoring program had expanded to serve children from neighboring buildings. Nia had settled into a rhythm of belonging that seemed to suit her perfectly. Her academic performance had improved dramatically, and her strategic intelligence was being channeled into positive leadership activities. She'd started a welcome committee for new residents and had convinced Mrs. Chen to let her help design informational materials about building community. Linda Foster had found part-time work that allowed her more flexibility, supported by the community's informal but reliable childcare network. More importantly, she'd stopped looking tired all the time and had begun talking about the future with genuine hope. Marshall heard footsteps on the roof access stairs and turned to see Nia, approaching with her after-school snack and homework. "Can I do math up here?" she asked. Mrs. Henderson said the fresh air helps with concentration. "Of course," Marshall replied, settling beside her on one of the benches they'd installed among the plants. As Nia worked on her multiplication tables, Marshall reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the most profound transformations began with the simplest acts: a child seeing magic in ordinary kindness, a lonely man remembering how to matter to others, strangers discovering they could choose to become family. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. In the distance, Marshall could see other buildings, other communities, other opportunities for connection and care. But for now, this rooftop, this garden, this chosen family was enough, more than enough. It was magic,